Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this discussion. So, as Rick pointed out this morning, we do not have time for formal introductions, but I would like to invite our SMEs to discuss this very interesting and contentious topic for some in regards to professional development. So this is something that's very close to my own heart, as I spend the majority of my days every day talking to individuals and organisations alike, determining their goals, both professionally for themselves or for their teams, and working out ways that we can achieve these goals. So I am very interested in this topic, and I hope you all are too. I'm sure you will be. If we have time for questions at the end, we will of course take them. We'll do our best. However, our SMEs here will be at the networking drinks and more than happy to answer any of your questions in that time. So without further ado, our subject matter experts are here and we're ready to get started. So according to acclaimed author Daniel H. Pink, there are 3 intrinsic motivators that provide employee confidence, capability, and well-being. And these are namely mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So the fusion of purpose, passion, and perseverance can ignite a profound motivation that empowers us to surmount various challenges. This synergy equips us to adaptively handle periods of transition and face setbacks with unwavering determination and resilience, factors that are paramount for modern security professionals as the landscape of risk is ever evolving. Professional development, effective professional development that is, helps us greatly with these efforts. So in order to address tenet number 1, which is mastery, the feeling of competence and continuous improvement through feedback, I'd like to pose my first question to Dennis. So, Dennis, how do you define competency? And how can others use this to evaluate their team's strengths?
Thank you for the question. Competency. Well, first I'd say, just before I dive into what competency is, just a little side note about teams in general. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I'm sure many of you already know this, a well-motivated and competent team can actually have a greater value than the sum of its parts. And what I mean by that is, if you had a single competent, motivated individual working at peak performance, say that's 100%, get a second, that's 200%. But if you're able to knit them together in a good team that can work together, they can bounce ideas off one, the actual outcome increases. So you actually get an outcome more like 220% or higher. There's quite a few studies on this. So teams are very important, but at the heart of that is the term competency. Now, my background is electronic security, and the standards we work to are flooded with the terms competency and appropriate qualifications. Drives me mad, because even though it says you should be competent, it doesn't say what it means. It says you should have qualifications, but it doesn't say what they are. So how do you establish that so that you can build an appropriate team? Well, a while back I did some academic research where I was evaluating the competency of surveyors within the electronic security market. I had to address this particular point very early on, because if I'm evaluating if they're competent, I needed to know what that competent meant. So I looked in the dictionary, right, great, got a definition. Well, not so great actually. I looked at HR departments, I looked job adverts, I looked all over the place to find if there was a clear, distinct definition of what competent meant. And I'm sure everybody in this room right now has probably got your own views and opinions on that. Probably you consider yourself competent, I'm sure you probably are. But when it comes to something in paper, on black and white, what is it? And the best definition I could find was from the UK's Health and Safety Executive, who had a very nice definition for competency. And they defined it as being a combination of training, knowledge, skills, and experience. Those 4 key elements. And I've described this as the closest thing you can get to a box-ticking exercise as you can. Because if you remove any one of those elements, according to the HSE, you are not competent. So when you put that into context, you're looking at employing a person or bringing someone into the team. They could be someone new to the sector or your particular area. Do they have training? They could be very well educated. Great, tick. Do they have knowledge? Well, that you can establish that by interviewing, by questioning, doing tests. Great, they've got skills. They wouldn't have got that far if they didn't have skills, but if they're missing the experience, that could let them down because they might not identify risks. But the inverse is just as applicable. You could have somebody with vast amounts of experience who've been doing the job for many, many years. So tons of experience, tons of skills because they've been doing the job. Lots of knowledge because you can ask them questions of how they've done it. But if they're missing the training, then their definition of competency starts to collapse at that point. And that can be very important when it comes to certain legal issues if they have to prove they are competent to a third party. I mentioned this, you can do this with teams, so anybody within the team, you can use those 4 key elements to establish their level of competency, identify areas of weakness where you can improve. As I mentioned with newer recruits, somebody who's come out of education, you can see they're lacking the experience, so mentoring. Perfect, we can establish that. Or older people, training. There's training everywhere these days. So it's nice and it's very clear how to define it there.
Thank you, Dennis. You've provided some clear definitions and key resources, so thank you ever so much. So the second tenet that we're going to explore is autonomy. So this is the feeling of being in control and working in a way that feels natural. So Megan, does the professional security arena do enough to equip young security professionals such as yourself with opportunities for autonomy?
Thank you. So I'm going to talk, obviously, from my experience in the civil nuclear industry, but I'm sure some of it, or a little bit, or all of it, will be transferable to your own organisations within the wider security industry. So I obviously came straight into the grad scheme from university, so I have a bachelor's and a master's degree, and it was still very nerve-wracking coming into what me and my friends call our first big girl job in the big wide world, and it's nerve-wracking in any job that you go into, but I think security is especially nerve-wracking because you're surrounded by people with years and years of experience in security, whether that's come from military or another avenue. So there needs to be things in place to ensure autonomy is cultivated and instilled within new entrants, just like it is within everyone who's been in the industry for years before. Autonomy comes with experience and training. It can sometimes be difficult, in my opinion, in security to get the necessary experience to create that feeling of autonomy. Individuals need to be trusted in leadership and project roles, which sometimes I think people within the industry find difficult to give to new entrants because we seem young, inexperienced, and unknowledgeable, which we probably are, but giving them a range of opportunities is how you create experienced and knowledgeable individuals with autonomy, and they are the future of your industry, so it's something that needs to be done. And then training in the security sector can be hard to come by, and from my experience, I would say people within the security industry aren't wholly aware of the training opportunities available to them. When I first started, I was searching for training because I knew I needed to increase my knowledge, and it just wasn't there, and the people around me, my colleagues at the time, didn't know what was out there to provide it to me. So without that training, you're then relying solely on your experience to direct your work, which often means you rely on following the direction and processes used by those you work with or under, rather than being able to develop your own techniques, which of course in turn affects innovation and the development and growth of this industry, because autonomy increases engagement over compliance. So without these two essential things, experience and training, autonomy can be difficult to achieve, especially for new entrants to the industry. And thinking about what was said earlier about Gen Z, they are a headstrong generation, and if they're not happy, they will leave. It's already known that that generation will move jobs frequently rather than stay in have a job for life, which was previously more common. So the industry risks losing these new generations if the support is not in place for them.
Brilliant, thank you. And Megan, just touching on what you've said previously to myself, your current training path through your graduate programme is such that you are doing cycles in different departments. So how has this helped you personally to professionalise this particular methodology?
So when I first started out at the Office for Nuclear Regulation, I knew nothing about the industry, nothing about security, nothing about nuclear. And I gradually a little bit developed over the course there, and then I managed to get into consultancy, which is a completely different side of the industry, and the people I worked with had completely different ways of working, different ways of thinking, so I learned a different aspect, and I now work in industry with Eddie at NRS, and again, it's a different aspect. There's different knowledge, different opportunities, and being able to move around the industry and see the different sides of it and work with people who all have completely different ways of thinking, ways of working, has really, well, it's made me who I am now, being able to sit on this stage and say this.
Brilliant, so happy to hear it, and thank you. So exploring the third and final tenet then, we're talking about purpose here. So purpose is defined as the knowledge that your work matters. So Eddie, this is a very all-encompassing question. There are those in industry with vast experience and very little qualification, and there are those with many qualifications and very little experience. How do we strike a balance, and does achieving this sweet spot contribute to a sense of purpose?
Yeah, thanks very much, and it's a great segue from what Megan said, and I am going to turn this into a little story, and the story is actually current. In civil nuclear, once upon a time in a not too distant past, we worked under a prescriptive regime, and for everyone in the room, you'll be aware that we're heavily regulated, and of course we're compliance driven, and for very good reasons, and that will remain and still remains, etc. But actually, the risks, etc., was at the behest of the Office for Nuclear Regulation. So in some respect, Guardians was used earlier on. We were kind of the guardians for the ONR to ensure that, that we mitigated and put the correct controls in place according to their requirements. So actually, we looked on the reliance of experience from the police, ex-forces, etc., who would then seek a second employment from that, who were very adherent to those rules and regulations and could understand, the script for that. So experience then was very much important. Now we've had a sweep change in terms of we now as duty holders manage the risks. So that means now the emphasis has absolutely changed. So no longer are we reliant on the Office for Nuclear Regulation to come up with those controls, to come up with the correct mitigations. So actually what we're asking of our own, myself and others in this room, we're asking of our practitioners to modernise, to be forward thinking, to understand against an evidence-based approach. And that means now that we've got to ensure that with our logic that we put enough information in place to satisfy the requirements under what's known as the security assessment principles. Now, that changed. However, we didn't. And as a result, we went from, probably thinking, yes, we did need that. We relied on the experience. But now what we need to complement that with different skills and qualifications. So we use SQEP, for example, suitably qualified experienced persons. So we need to find that coalescence between the two of experience and qualifications to get that even match. And why do I say that? Is because Megan was absolutely right. And in my role, as aside from being the head of security and safeguards at Nuclear Restoration Services, I'm the chair of the Safety Directors Forum Subsecurity Working Group. And it became very apparent when I took the chair, and there's some excellent security professionals, by the way, in this group, seasoned operators, one of which are in this room. And we acknowledge the reality that we've missed a trick on the basis that you can be experienced, but there is no training behind it. There is actually no role profiling, or very little, or it's not visible enough. Or actually what we were doing as companies, as organizations, we were doing our own things. So what we were doing, we were kind of mapping out our own language, so to speak. And it was evidently becoming more difficult for the regulator to regulate, to understand when enough is enough, because we were all invariably doing things differently. So we're now taking an approach, and I'm delighted to say, that actually it's going very, very well indeed. But our work doesn't stop. And the reason why I say this is because we now need to seek to address the absence of a career pathway for the likes of Megan to come in and become the future, in civil nuclear or defence nuclear. Because otherwise we've got such an age gap amongst our colleagues, and somebody like me will retire in 5 years' time, and I'll go off on my merry way, but we're going to leave a gap if we don't do anything about it. So what we need to do is that we need to now look at these, we are looking at the government security framework, an excellent piece of work, by the way, that was conducted. And what we want to do is we want to nuclearize it. So we want to plagiarize with pleasure, but we don't want to make it complex, because it's already complex. So we want to simplify some of the measures to enable those that are coming in, to have a well-founded, a well-defined set of training requirements, a set of role requirements against a defined pathway, against a defined pipeline. So the gap analysis will tell us what is in the government security framework already, what we need to achieve to map that across, and then what we're doing is we're dovetailing some of the training requirements with ONR, with DESNES, etc., with other organisations to come up with what we believe is suitable and acceptable. Because remember, the reason why I say now it's important that we have this interrelationship, between experience and qualifications, is because we have to assure the regulator that we're competent. We have to assure the regulator that we've got our governance and assurance structures in place, and that we meet those requirements, because we don't want to get it wrong for good reasons. So after the gap analysis, what we're going to do is go into a framework or a pipeline of understanding what the next levels are. So there's people out there that could tell us, what do we need to nuclearize academically? What do we actually need to say this is a security professional? Most of us have got generic qualifications and degrees, etc. But how do we become specific? So how do we become more academic and profile those requirements to make sure then that we've got a succession and a progressive pipeline for those that are coming in? So we recognize the gaps, and we recognize that we need to be more agile and dynamic in our approach as security professionals.
Couldn't agree more, thank you very much. So my final question is to all of our SMEs. Eddie, if I could start with you. If you could add an additional motivation factor complementing mastery, autonomy and purpose, what would this be and why?
Psychological safety, absolutely. Somebody mentioned it earlier on, and I think we all want to come to work and we want to be recognised and rewarded, and we want to feel empowered that we've done something well. What is not good is when we have an environment where we assume motives. And that means where, if somebody's not actually at their best for one reason or another, so there may be, our filters and our blind spots, we've missed that. But as a result of that, we've got to make sure that we can pick up on the strengths of people, and we can do that on a continuum. And we do that on a consistent basis. So it means that when we are now, because we are struggling, for talent recruitment and talent retention. So when we look at the whole thing, I think first and foremost is to make sure that people, when they come to work, they know that they're doing a great job and they're being rewarded for that. So instead of assuming motives, we assume positive intent. And with that, that means psychologically safety. We will be psychologically safe. We don't get into an environment where we then suffer with insider risks, and all the other, possibilities that could come out from it, because we can ill afford that as security professionals.
Thank you, Eddie. Megan?
I was actually going to say the same, because you want to go to work and feel valued, not just valued, but noticed, and you want the people you work with or the people you work for to notice you, notice any changes in yourself, and you want to do good work when you are valued for that work, and as Eddie says, retention is quite a big issue, and I think psychological safety probably stems from a lot of that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yourself?
I think, everything that's said is exactly what I would have said. When people go to work, part of the motivation, they need to know that what they are doing is important. So it's very useful for people to see the reasoning behind the tasks, and why they are doing it in the first place. But also it's very useful if they can show their competency, is that word again, to anybody, and that can be achieved by some of the organisations here today, and the ASC and their registrar of consultants. Perfect example of way you can demonstrate you are competent by being a member of them, or the Security Institute. There are many ways, and very rapidly, I'll just mention if you are looking at anything electronic security related, camera systems, alarms, access, you should ideally now start encouraging in your tenders, in your documentation, that any engineer working on your property holds a ECA gold card, which is specific for security technicians to hold. A bit like gas safe, but related to security systems. But it's a way that you can feel confidence that the person undertaking the task is competent.
Thank you, Dennis. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we will not be able to take questions. However, like said at the beginning, we are available after the event at the networking drinks, so please do feel free to approach us and put us to the test with your questions. Dennis, Megan, Eddie, thank you ever so much, and thank you.
Thank you.